warning, the next few segments will include a little graphic PG-13 kind of material. Because you see, my next guest was just 12 years old when she says her addiction to pornography began, an obsession that turned into sex addiction. Erica Garza has written about her struggle to keep her addictions in check in her new, revealing, very raw book called Getting Off. Again, if you have young children in the room, we're going to be discussing topics that may not be appropriate. I want to welcome her because this is a difficult story for her to tell, and it took a lot of courage to tell it. This is how her story began.
The more I watched porn, the more it preoccupied my mind, so it became a huge obsession for me. So I couldn't really interact with other people without thinking of, could this lead to sex? I was very lucky to have a stable, loving, supported childhood. There was no big trauma. When I was 12 years old, I was diagnosed with scoliosis, and so I had to wear a back brace for 2 years. And that was the beginning of really starting to feel insecure and different from people around me. If I stayed up late enough, I could listen to this show called Loveline, which was a syndicated show about drug addiction and love and sex and relationships. And I remember a caller calling in, a woman, and she said that she had discovered this really mind-blowing way to have orgasms. So I tried it, and it was mind-blowing. I started to use the porn and the masturbation as a method of coping. I thought that I was doing something wrong, so that just produced a huge layer of shame inside of my sexuality. And it was hard for me to separate shame from my sexuality and my pleasure. The first thing was chat room encounters, and then downloading pictures came about, and then streaming websites came around, and so that every time I felt like maybe my interest might die out, new stimuli just kept coming out, so it was always very enticing and fresh. It just became a main priority in my life.
And Erica Garza joins me now. Erica, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you were 12 when you first sort of had your first experience. And I'm sure a lot of people were like, what was the mind-blowing thing, right? Which you can read about it in the book. But it wasn't so much the joy of the feelings, it became an obsession for you, right? I mean, what was the driver to make you do it so often, over and over and over, even at that young age?
Well, I think that my first exploration with masturbation and porn started off pretty normally. You know, I think most kids around that age would be curious and explore their body. But I was diagnosed with scoliosis not long after that discovery. And that's when things started to change for me. I started to really think of myself as something weird or something different and shameful. And I found that using porn and masturbating were effective methods of coping with that.
It was like an escape for you.
Right. Yeah, it was a way for me to get out of my head, a way for me to not think about any sort of emotional difficulties that came up for me that I didn't know how to deal with properly.
You write about how you would be in the school, at school, and you'd go into the bathroom stalls and have to do it. And right. We're asking yourself, is this normal? Are other girls doing this? I mean, did you have the light bulb that like, it isn't? Probably they aren't.
Yeah, and I think that just came out of all the silence that comes around sex as a young woman, as a young girl. Nobody was talking about it. And I was raised Catholic, and my parents, they didn't really talk to me about it. And I think that's because their parents didn't really talk to them about sex. And so I just had this idea that I was doing something bad and something wrong. And I think that if people were talking about it, that I might have felt comfort, and I might have felt like I was doing something that was completely normal. Right. And it would have changed my perspective.
I don't think, the sort of self-pleasure for anyone coming of age there's nothing abnormal about it, right? It was the amount, the frequency, and the dominance that it wound up having on your life, certainly as you became an adult. But was that the case even as a sort of tweener into your teens?
Yes, it definitely became an obsession. It became a way for me to cope with anything that came up that felt too big and too scary. And I never really felt comfortable doing it. There was never this point early on where I felt like I was worthy of this kind of pleasure. It just felt like something I was doing. And if people found out that I was doing it, then they would certainly think that I was disgusting and not want anything to do with me.
The theme in the book, these are some of the emotions and adjectives she uses to describe herself and how she felt. Emptiness, shame, isolated, revolting, guilt. pitiful, worthless. Was that all part of it? I mean, was that, in other words, what I'm trying to figure out is whether those are the feelings that led to the addiction or those are the feelings caused by the behavior associated with the addiction.
I think both. Certainly it started that way. You know, I had these feelings of inadequacy because I felt so different from everybody else. But as I continued to cope in this way and nobody was talking about it, then those feelings just continued and became bigger than they should have.
And how big a role did the internet play?
A huge role.
Especially when you were first sort of getting into this.
Right, so I feel like my addiction coincided with the digital age. And so it started with softcore
so to speak.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, the internet came about when I was around 12, 13. And so downloading pictures became a thing, chat room encounters. And every time that I might have gotten over it and maybe lost interest, some new stimuli would come out to get me engaged and enticed all over again.
Mm-hmm. And we're back now with Erica Garza, who says she has spent her life addicted to pornography and sex, beginning at age 12. A topic, again, we want to warn our viewers, may not be suitable for young children. Erica describes in detail in her book how she, and to us, how she knew that her addiction was escalating.
I started off watching really mild porn, but as time went on and I started watching more of it, I needed to see categories that made me feel excited again. I had to look at scenes that upset me and also that produced that shame in me that I had first found with my first experience of masturbation.
And Erica Garza is back with us. So how did that need for sort of demeaning, progressively dirty pornography affect your real life relationships?
So like many other gateway drugs, I would say softcore porn, used to excite me. And then as time went on, I needed to find harder clips or hardcore clips in order to stay excited. And it also made me feel shocked and ashamed. And because that shame had been such an important aspect of my sexuality and my pleasure from the beginning, I continued to seek out that feeling. And I also sought that feeling in my real life relationships with people. And so that I put myself into some destructive and unhealthy situations.
Mm-hmm. You write that you dated various people and thought if you weren't treated well, right, I don't deserve to be treated well.
Right.
He is not a good man because I don't deserve a good man.
Yes. Yeah, and that just stemmed from my inadequacy and my feelings of worthlessness and being afraid of being found out. I thought I needed to have this wall between me and another person. If they found out the real me, then they would really run away. So I might as well just stick with these the relationships that didn't really serve me that well or value me because I didn't value myself.
So how bad did it get? I mean, you're pretty open in the book about some of the places you visited and some of the things you did that I think most of us think it's too seedy. A young, beautiful woman wouldn't be caught dead in these places.
Well, my need for this sexual release just took me to places that I wouldn't have normally went to in my rational mind. But, a lot of addiction is irrational and driven by these urges that I felt powerless against.
Like Times Square peep shows?
Times Square peep shows. Right, and some, unsafe situations I put myself into.
Was that part of it for you? The danger, the seediness of it?
Sure, there was a thrill, and it did make me feel ashamed, and shame was a huge part of my pleasure. So I sought those experiences with that mission in mind.
Even when you got into otherwise healthy relationships with men who loved you, who, you write about, I think it was Elliot, and you were having relations with him once or twice a week, which you write was a huge problem for you. So you weren't able to sort of slip into the quote unquote normal relationship.
Right, and I think that would have required me to surrender myself to a kind of intimacy that just felt unfamiliar to me, and I didn't really know how to handle that in a healthy way.
So how did you know things had spun out of control, that this had crossed over to an unmanageable place?
So I'd known throughout my 20s that I had this problem with sex, and I just didn't really know what to do about it. And I think that that's the case for a lot of sex addicts, especially women. You don't really know where to turn to for help. But I had been sabotaging many of my relationships, and I just got to a place where I felt really unhappy and really stuck, and I wanted to change. And so I had sabotaged another relationship, and one that I particularly valued, and I knew that I wanted to change.
The men in your life were saying, you're a sex addict.
It came up a few times, but in one situation where I was engaged to somebody in New York, it came up and I didn't really want to listen to it, and I was still in denial at that point.
And we're back now with Erica Garza, who says she has an addiction to sex that started at age 12. Also joining us is Robert Weiss, author of Sex Addiction 101. He's a digital age intimacy and relationships expert. He has not treated Erica, but he's here to help us put some perspective onto this. First, let me ask you, Erica, do you consider yourself currently, present day, a sex addict?
I do not.
You feel like you've worked through it?
I consider myself in recovery for sex addiction, and I do consider my past as being a sex addict, but I don't view myself in that lens anymore. You and your husband, you write in the book, you're still having threesomes, but it's not an addiction for you. Right, and I'm a sexual being, and I've always been experimental and open-minded, and it really wasn't about stopping that and cutting off that part of myself. I really wanted to find balance with that and just not feel the shame aspect anymore. Getting it under control. Right. There's a great line in the book where you talk about, I'm paraphrasing, but what if I could go back and instead of taking back my sins, I took back my shame? Think of that. Just think about that in your own life. Instead of taking back your sins, you take back your shame. Have you been able to do that? It's an ongoing effort, but yes, and I think it's really important. I don't have the desire to stay stuck. I don't have the desire to regret my past and do anything destructive that would make me feel bad anymore. I want to live healthy, and I want to continue being a healthy sexual being without feeling bad about it. Rob, how many sex addicts are women?
About 25% of sex addicts are women. When I think about it, it's kind of like with eating disorders. We have about 25% men and about 80% women, 75%. It's kind of switched with sex. We have about 70% men and about 30% women. And the dangers of the internet. I mean, how big of a factor is that in sex addiction? Well, it's the accessibility that is really the issue. Back in the day, if I wanted to get some porn, I had to go somewhere, go to a store, and it was icky, and I didn't want anyone to see me there, and I had to rent something, maybe I had to return it. Now it's so immediate. It's like, I think of the apps and the online porn like having cocaine in the medicine cabinet. It's just so easy to press that button and there it is. And there isn't that time. But it's more like having pot and cocaine and then heroin in the medicine cabinet. Absolutely. Because as Erica talks about, sort of the gateway through to the darker and darker stuff, which affected her real life relationships. So is there anything we can do about them? And as a mother of 3 children, I worry about this. Well, in terms of porn, there's a lot that parents need to be doing. I don't know that our schools always teach children about intimacy and sexuality and relationship. They learn the birds and the bees and the body parts, but I think right now parents really need to step up and talk to their children about intimate and relationship-based sexuality, and they need to be talking about internet porn. How so? Well, there are books out there now. I don't know if parents are aware of it, but it'd be so helpful. There are how to talk to your 6-year-old about adult images, how to talk to your 8-year-old. These are conversations should be held early and young, so kids feel comfortable saying, I saw this, Mom, I don't know what to do. They should feel that way rather than, I've got to hide this and this is bad and I'm ashamed. There are some people who don't believe sex addiction is a real thing. That's true. Is it a real thing? Well, we'll have a diagnosis in Europe this year, and we'll have a diagnosis in the States next year. So that's kind of going away as we see the brain science. And, we only have one pleasure center in the brain. It doesn't matter whether I'm doing cocaine, or I'm drinking, or I'm gambling, or I'm engaging in sex. It still is a distracting, emotional way for me to escape or to feel better. Sex is sort of like a food addiction in that, unlike heroin addiction, you don't show up at in your day-to-day life, heroin is not necessarily available, but sex is part of a normal, healthy lifestyle and relationship and marriage. And what is this is very brave of you to put this out there and write so openly about it. And I ask you about your daughter only because when I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, my daughter ever read that, So what are your feelings about that, and why did you write the book? I'll cross that bridge when I get to it with my daughter, but I do hope to answer any questions she has with just honesty. And I don't think that it's wrong for a child to see their parent vulnerable and to see that I've made some mistakes and I've gotten through them. And the purpose of writing the book was not just to extend compassion to myself and understand myself better, but really to help other people who are going through this and feeling so alone and so afraid that it's okay, that there's somebody out there who understands. Go ahead, Rob. I just can't tell you how much of a need there is for women to have a place to talk about this. I've been treating men and women for almost 30 years with sexual and intimacy disorders. And men, you know, they have a problem, they talk about it, but it's so much harder for a woman to come forward with a sexual problem. We all know what names we give women when they act out sexually. Men are studs and players, you know, women not so nice.
We guilt and we shame women for being sexual beings at all, never mind in the way that Erica owns.
And I really admire you, Erica, because you're not, with a lot of folks I see, they become very rigid. You know, like I'm going to cut sex out, or I'm going to cut, it has to be this. And you're saying, no, I want to be a fluid, open human being, but I don't want to do things that hurt me or hurt the people I love or don't allow me to grow my life. So I think you're on the right path.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. All the best. And Erica's book, again, it's called Getting Off, is out now. We'll be right back.
Hello, Today fans. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking that button down there and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives.